Welcome back to the Stroke of Midnight. Fortunately, we had to take last week off. I bit off a little bit more than I could chew, getting my bud Daily Bread out on the road, and our schedules just got completely out of whack. But we are back, and we are going to try something a little different from what we've done over the last few episodes. I figure it would be good to give everyone a little more insight into how Dorian and myself see things. Because if we're going to tell you about the things that inspire us, it's probably important that you understand what they're inspiring. So
some context would probably be nice.
Yeah, a little context into who we are as creatives. A lot of you guys out there listening probably have a good idea of who I am, but you're still getting to know Dorian. And I think, just a nice loose conversation about creativity. So here's the kicker. In my typical fashion of improvisatory magic, I've decided to let Dorian surprise me with what this topic of conversation will be today. Now, I have a sort of an idea because we have a few different ones that we've tossed around, but I don't know which one he's going to pick right now. And we have not planned anything. So this should be fun. A nice loose conversation between two friends about the wacky world of what, Dorian?
Today, Greg. And first, I wanted to say thank you for throwing yourself under the bus for the lack of an episode last week, because I was going to do it, but you spared me the hardship of doing so. So today we are going to discuss something that seemed, when you first pitched this whole podcast to me, seemed like a really, really just rich piece of meat that was sitting there waiting for us to sink our teeth into, which is to talk about light. That you as a lighting designer, me as a filmmaker, light is obviously incredibly important to the things that we do, but I think in very different ways, but also in very similar ways. So I thought that discussing how each of us look at, think about, and utilize light in our creative endeavors, and kind of like hit on the differences and similarities and those flowing parallels and those violent intersections between our approaches to this medium.
I love this. Yeah. Fantastic. Let's talk about light.
Yeah.
So I think it's fairly obvious when you talk about my side of this. I am a concert lighting designer. I translate what I hear and experience into some sort of visual abstract continuity. I try to create a relative path between the music and some sort of visual landscape. But I think in your world, Dorian, I think there's a lot that goes unnoticed, because more often than not, and this is, from my very amateurish sort of knowledge of filmmaking, the idea is to make the scene as natural as possible. Right?
Sometimes. Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yes.
Here we go. All right. So I want to start this off by when you set a scene, or let's even backtrack a little bit more than that. When you start a project, I have to assume that there is a greater purpose to what the lighting impact is meant to be. Right.
Absolutely.
So why don't you kind of talk through that a little bit, and I'm going to see what parallels I can create in my world.
So definitely, that is, at the beginning of any kind of film production, whether it be like a feature film, which is going to be this massive, 2+ year kind of commitment from everyone, versus like a short film or a music video that might be done in like a weekend. There's always a massive discussion about lighting, just as much as the very visible and more discussed elements of filmmaking, such as like the cinematography itself, which lighting is definitely a part of. But generally, I think when people outside of the film world talk about cinematography, they're talking specifically about shots. And that's more so, I think, what that kind of shorthand becomes. But the cinematographer is also the one responsible for the lighting design, which is going to influence the shots, of course, and either elevate them or not. But yeah, so from the ground up, there's a discussion about, not just like color palettes, but also design. Are we going for something natural? In which case, where we don't want to draw attention to the lighting because we want people to get immersed into the dialogue, say. Or if we're doing like, say, like a crazy, I don't know, like surrealist rock and roll revenge thriller kind of a movie, being totally realistic might not be the order of the day, because you might want the scene to feel very heightened and very subjective, and like we're not actually in the real world, so to speak. We're either in somewhere that's a fantastical world, or perhaps even we are witnessing the fever dream of a character whose, perception we've inhabited as a result of, telling the story. So we're sort of seeing things through somebody's perception rather than through like an objective lens of like, this is the world as it appears to everybody. There's I can't remember the exact word, but so in Latin, the word for eye actually means to project. I can't remember the exact term, but and so that's always been very indicative to me of the fact that like our eyes don't take things in, they project our perceptions onto the world. Our biases, the things that we desire, the things that we are important to us or are, standing out in our mind at the time. Like, a simple example would be like when you buy a new car and then all of a sudden you see everybody's driving the same car. It's not like everybody went out and bought that car that day, but you're now just noticing it. So you're sort of like, your perception is not just based on objective information coming in, but where your mind's at and the things you're thinking about are going to determine what you notice. Because there's so much visual information coming at you every day that subconsciously your mind just sort of throws a bunch of stuff away and then brings other things to the forefront. So that kind of priority can shift within a person's mind. So to bring it back around to film, the great filmmakers understand this and utilize that to their advantage. So they sort of create, expectations and certain perceptions that then they can subvert or flip on themselves or completely respect and take them down the path you'd expect them to go down. But that's all, what a great filmmaker does is kind of like guide that whole experience, and using lighting and the way that you're going to notice or not notice certain things within scenes and how that's going to change over the course of the film is what a great filmmaker does. It's called directing. There's a few people out there. There's a few people out there that do it, but not a lot.
That's an interesting. Before you go any further, I think like the one thing that I kind of like picked up there is like it's and using lighting as a way to guide the viewer in whichever direction you want them to be led. I think that's a very interesting kind of concept where if you want the focus to be on the people, then the lighting becomes more natural. But if you want the focus to be, or if you want to guide the people into this understanding that like this isn't normal life, then the lighting becomes much more in the foreground.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're manipulating the entire scene to break the expectations of normality, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can use them to, essentially like, a scene can be playing out, but the lighting can kind of inform you what the mood of the characters is. They might be having a polite conversation, but if they hate each other, you light that scene red or something and, have them having this like quote unquote civil conversations kind of a very like, kind of darker, more sinister edge to it, so you can kind of imply what's going on internally even while we're watching what's happening externally.
Yeah. And that's where like, I think the biggest parallel is between what we both do, right? Is you're speaking to the audience non-verbally.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
whether you're conveying the emotion of the scene, or whether you're conveying the absurdity of the scene, or whether you're just laying back and letting other things be more important, there's ways to kind of, manipulate lighting to accomplish all of those goals. It's an extremely powerful tool, one that for a long time I took for granted. And I think, like, I wonder, for you, I think maybe it's a little different in film, because there's such rich history, especially with lighting, because I think lighting was probably used better earlier on in cinema than it is now, with the reliance of CGI and all those things. But I think for a long time, I never truly appreciated how powerful lighting can be, in that sense of, like, if I can restrain myself, I can say more than if I just blah, 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 blast everyone constantly.
Right.
And so I think, when we talk about cinema, I think, the first person that always comes to my mind is Alfred Hitchcock. I feel like he was a master of using lighting in film. And probably because he started in the black and white era. And so you didn't have color, and you didn't have, all he had to work with was contrast. And, how you can, like, create tension, and how you can create anxiety with very subtle, lighting tricks, has always been something that, like, just blew my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I mean, he was a big pioneer, even in terms of, like, lighting design and the way that it was utilized within that era of filmmaking. And I personally agree as well that, like, lighting was so much more expressive in the older days of film than it is now. In the digital era, not to get too into the weeds technically, but, film, especially in the 20s, 30s, 40s, was much less sensitive to light than, like, the digital cameras that we have now. So, like, you needed a giant fucking light, to even just get somebody's face exposed. So in a lot of ways, it forced you to be in control of the light, because, like, if you were putting something somewhere, you weren't just going to, like, flood a room and then you could sculpt it. It was like, no, you kind of needed, everything had to be really specific. Nowadays, like, I can turn on these couple of, like, battery powered tube lights and, light up my whole room and everything. And so, and, like, there's been a push more so with digital stuff too, with, like, okay, it's 4K, it's HDR. We want everything to be, like, bright and shiny, and very colorful and all that stuff. So, like, cameras and lighting and, a lot of what I will very callously refer to as content nowadays, is lit this way. So that way, when you look at it on your phone, on your nice, like, OLED screen, it's like, that red is, like, explosive, and, like, you can see everything. There's no shadows, your whole screen is lit up. And that's become kind of, like, the more prevalent attitude within, like, prestige television and even film nowadays. There's obviously exceptions to that, but a lot of what you see is kind of, like, lit that way. It's not expressive. It's there to, like, make your screen appear like it was worth the $2,000 or whatever you spent on it, so that you'll continue buying their product down the road. So it, I'll end my rant about current filmmaking trends there, but yeah, and so as a result, I 100% agree that back in the day, when it was much more about the storytelling and the storytelling alone, and, like, how can we push this medium forward, and find new ways of expressing these ideas that have been, retread through several films, in the past, themes, story beats, whatever they are. That was a time when it was magical, to be honest. But Hitchcock in particular, there's one moment that comes to mind. It's I mistakenly, we did, like, a test podcast a few months ago, and I mistakenly quoted this as being part of the movie Notorious. It's not Notorious. That movie has a key that's very prevalent. But there's a different movie of his where I believe it's Cary Grant is carrying a glass of milk up some stairs, and there's a question as to whether or not this milk is poisoned. That's kind of the whole, conflict driving the entire, is like, is this guy a killer or isn't he? And so he's, bringing this glass of milk up the stairs, and it's, believed by one of the characters. And of course, this paranoia through Hitchcock's brilliant storytelling is passed along to the audience, that like we all are kind of like in belief that like he's bringing this killer glass of milk up the stairs. So Hitchcock decided to basically, like, the platter that he was holding it on, they put like a light like in between his hand and the glass of milk underneath the platter, so that the light was shining up into the glass of milk, and this glass of milk is just like glowing. It's this like luminescent, piece within the frame. And like, there's no way your eye doesn't go straight to this thing, the whole way up. Cause it's just like, it's totally unnatural looking. The rest of the movie is very naturalistic, in a lot of, in terms of its look and everything. And this is one moment where he just was like, no, this is something that needs to be like 1,000% objective or subjective. I mean, this is directly like speaking to the audience's perception of the moment, and we're going to heighten that, so that's a moment where like lighting in particular becomes very visible within the frame. It seems counterintuitive to the idea of like, there's this whole concept in film of like suspension of disbelief, that like we all know when we watch a film that it's not real.
Sure.
But if you do it well enough, the audience is willing to suspend that disbelief and sort of buy into the fiction. So there's a lot of, and that's why I think, as you said at the beginning, that the general approach is to go more natural with lighting, is because that was kind of the thought, was that, well, you don't want to break that suspension of disbelief by producing stuff that's like intentionally very fake, because then people stop buying into the fiction of it. That's proven to be wrong in a lot of ways. But this was one moment where like we had a whole film that was like pushing in this one direction of like keeping it natural, keeping it feeling very, very entrenched in the real world. And then right at the climax, having this moment that's just like shockingly unnatural.
Yeah. When you break expectations, that's an interesting concept, because I feel like that's something that I strive for constantly, like breaking expectations, right? Where you're like, it's this. You beat someone over the head with this concept, and then the second you turn that corner and you do something completely the opposite, it carries so much more weight, because you broke expectations. And, and people generally speaking don't see that coming. Yeah. So you get the wow factor, like the surprise effect. There's this thing that I've been noticing more so here's a perfect example of breaking expectations. So what did I point out to you when we went to that wrestling show in Chicago?
Oh, so I mean, the thing that really stuck out to me was the final match.
The steel cage match.
Yeah, the steel cage match. Yeah.
So the WWE, I'm going to go back to this, but this is an amazing example of breaking expectations.
No,
and
it was.
And it fucking blew my mind, because I've been watching wrestling forever and I've never seen them do this. So for the main event steel cage match, they turned off all of the production in the house, which they never do. All of the video walls, everything. And they went to old school, like boxing style, just white lights down on the ring. And it created such an incredible atmosphere for what that match was supposed to be, because it felt like a very old school match, and it felt like we went back to like 1985. And it was the first thing I pointed out to you. And I could not believe that they were doing it. And so like somebody like me, who's like super dialed into everything that's going on, can still be surprised, because they took the effort to surprise everyone. And like, sometimes it's those simple things. You don't have to turn all the lights on. Sometimes you have to turn them all off.
Yeah.
And like,
it was very striking. I mean, even for me, it was like you could feel the change, just among the crowd, and like it just gave it such gravity, because it was like, okay, no, like all eyes here. Yeah, exactly. During all the other matches, it's like, the whole room's lit up. you can see the whole crowd. There's all these screens around with advertisements on and whatnot. If you need to go get a refreshment or run to the bathroom, it's no problem. But like once they shut it down, I mean, it was like pitch black in that room, aside from just like this one just torch of light, in the middle.
Incredible. Yeah.
It was very cool.
I think when you talk about like when you talk about how like shifting the experience, there's always these like intentions, right? But sometimes it's the accidents also that like can help, for me, right? There have been several times where an accident becomes like my greatest success. And I wonder, like in cinema, like, do you find yourself in those situations where you're like, I didn't mean for that to happen, but like, here it is. And this works way better than anything I thought could have worked.
Constantly. And it is the actual secret to success of, I think, every great filmmaker is embracing that stuff.
Yeah.
Because it happens all the time. I mean, you can have the most, powerful vision in the world and like come up with the greatest scene, but like, sometimes an actor just like, kind of almost trips a little bit, while they're walking, but like recovers in a way that's like very in character, and maybe even they like improv a quick line or something, and it just adds this whole life to the scene that like wasn't there before,
Sure.
Things like that. But you have to be, you have to, I think, as always with, a lot of collaborative creative stuff, you got to check your ego at the door. It's like, just because it wasn't 100% your idea doesn't mean it shouldn't be there, So sometimes other people contribute great things, and sometimes, totally accidentally. But, having the understanding of the story and the characters and what you're trying to accomplish with the film, that will allow you to make a decision about like when an accident is right or when it's not right, for a scene or a character. Because it might be really funny at the moment, because film sets are like generally kind of like high pressure, scenarios. There's, a lot of money on the line. Time is the enemy, of course. There's so much to do and so many things to coordinate to make it all happen and make your day. That, it's when something like, a flub or something happens, it breaks the tension and everybody has like a really hilarious moment on set. And it becomes sort of this like unifying moment where, we all kind of like get to like drop that pressure and that facade for a moment. So it's easy for like that to kind of influence you being there as the filmmaker and think like, oh, this was this hilarious moment. It's not. It was funny to everyone that was in the room that was like, white knuckling their way through the day. Like had this one moment of levity. Yeah, it was fucking hilarious, but like, that might not translate to an audience necessarily.
Sure.
But sometimes there are things that do, and like you have to really kind of maintain that understanding and be able to like separate yourself and your personal reactions from like, the part of you that's like judging the story and trying to, push the vision for the story forward. So yeah, no, I mean, those types of accidents happen all the time, but I've fallen into this before where there were like things I've included that we all thought were hilarious. And then when I show it to people, they're like, what was that?
Yeah. I mean,
like, I guess you had to be there,
Yeah, you had to be there. There's always those moments. I think, so here's an interesting concept, because this is something I struggle with constantly. Well, I don't struggle with it so much anymore. I've learned how to embrace it, but I do get roasted from time to time because of the choices that I make under these circumstances. So obviously, a lot of what we're talking about is controlling the environment, right? And so like, obviously we have much more control over lighting when we're indoors. Now, when you're shooting outdoors, when I'm doing a concert outdoors, the entire, game changes, because you're battling with God and the almighty light of the sun, or lack thereof.
Right. Yeah.
So in my world, we have, smoke machines and stuff that help accentuate, the lighting, because a lot of these things, to actually get definition out of high powered lights, you need to have smoke for the light to reflect off of. And that's what gives us contrast from light to light. So if it's really windy, we lose a lot of that contrast. And so then, it's my responsibility to try to create that contrast elsewhere, generally with the video walls or whatever. But what ends up happening more often than not is people have this misconception that I didn't have certain things, i.e. lasers or whatever. And they're there. You just might not see them as well that day. So like, the funniest thing in the world to me is that like there are people that understand what is happening and how it's happening, and then they can kind of, accept things for what they are. I find myself being very open to everything. So like if we're outdoors and it's really windy, I just change the approach of the light show. You don't always have that luxury. So like when you're shooting, like what kind of framework do you work within to say, hey, like we need this amount of light, natural light, or hey, we want to wait until it's dark, or like what's the mindset there?
Yeah. Oh man. I mean, that's
obviously it's case by case, but
right. And like those are the moments where like you make your bones as a director, it's when there's only enough light for one shot left, but there's two that you absolutely have to have, what do you do? And you've got to get incredibly creative and, work with the people around you to figure out what the best, path forward is. It's very, very case by case. But, I mean, oftentimes what my process is to like take 30 seconds to like shit myself. And, Werner Herzog has a great quote about, he said, moments of despondency should be kept brief and private, which, I don't know if he's talking about, in life as a whole. Probably for him, yes. But I take that as suggestion for on a film set, because it's good that, if your general like if you're in a war and your general breaks down and starts crying, it's like, it's not going to do a lot for morale, right?
Yeah, definitely not.
Yeah. So, directing a film is kind of the same way. Everyone's looking to you for answers and guidance on like how we get through the day and like, wrap everything up in a way that we can all feel proud of. And if you're suddenly just like, fuck, what do I do? It's not going to inspire the best out of everyone else. So, I usually kind of have a moment to myself real quick and just go like, okay, shit, this sucks. What do we do? And then I turn around and go, okay, let's talk about this. And the main thing is to, again, what I was talking about with being able to identify accidents that happen on set that are additive versus, diminishing. That's where it really comes down to knowing like what is important, what is actually important here. Because like there's shots that I want because like they're going to look really good, or they're going to add some kind of production value or flair, to the movie, but they're not necessary. Like the story could be told without them. So it's things like that where you've got to like, start killing your babies, as they say. This, you might have had this shot that like was the whole reason you wanted to do this entire scene. But then, in terms of like what needs to happen from a storytelling standpoint, it's actually not important. And so really what you've got to do is start making some really, really tough decisions about like, okay, what do I need here and what do I want? Because usually you're going to find out pretty quickly that the stuff that you are the most worried about is stuff that you actually really just want but don't need.
There you go.
So yeah, and then you start, so for me personally, one of the biggest boons on a film set is having the position of first assistant director. There's some very strange titles on film sets because there's a first assistant director, there's a second assistant director, and then there's a second assistant director. So they all have specific jobs, but the first assistant director, their job mainly is basically to kind of be your timekeeper and to keep you on track with like, hey, you're spending too much time on this one shot. You've still, don't forget about the other 14 that need to happen before we leave this location,
Yeah.
So they'll usually be on your ass. And if you have a good first AD, like you'll be, you'll start getting the like, hey, you got to think about what shots you want to cut because you don't have time. A bit early on, but sometimes just shit happens, a cloud rolls in or something, and all of a sudden your sunny day is gone without any kind of expectation of that happening. So so yeah, that's again where it just comes down to like prioritization, and really having a bead on, and then within that too, it's like, okay, well, you don't want to get the stuff you need in like the most boring way possible, and like maybe it feels incongruent with the way the rest of the scene was shot, because like you had all these like interesting stylized like insert shots, but then the last half of the scene is just like this one wide shot because that's all you had time to do. That's also not really going to work. So there is still some pressure to like be creative in the way that you implement that ultimate response in a way that like visually is going to fit with the rest of the scene. So that's where it gets tricky, and that's where it comes down to, I don't know, talent and discipline, I guess. Being able to make those determinations, but in terms of just where the like mindset goes, it's like, okay, prioritize here. What do we have to have? What gets us a complete scene, and like let's focus on that and how to make it as good as possible.
So I think here's another fun little, I think this could be a good lesson for anyone who's interested in like photography, filmmaking, anything. The golden hour phenomenon. I know this is a big deal, especially in photography. I feel like maybe even more so than film, but explain to the audience what makes the golden hour so special.
Yeah.
When you're capturing things.
Yeah. The first thing to notice if you're going to try to capture golden hour is that golden hour is actually about 15 minutes.
Yeah.
So you better be fast. It's that beautiful, time of night, where the sun, hits the horizon and the whole sky just kind of like fills with this golden light. You get this beautiful, it doesn't look like any other time of day. It doesn't look like anything else. It looks completely surreal, but those moments where sometimes where you step outside at like, depending on what time of year it is, but like, right before it actually gets dark out, and right like that about 15 minutes when the sun is setting, right before it actually is completely gone. I've had explained to me exactly what this phenomenon is from like a scientific standpoint many years ago, and I can't recall it well enough to describe it with any accuracy here. But it has something to do with like like the angle of the light and the way it's like refracting off of like the atmosphere and creates this sort of glow rather than just sort of a direct, light source. You all of a sudden get this kind of diffused colored light that just seems to permeate everything. And, it's like you can feel your perception change. So not only that, but like because the sun is, off in the distance and like hitting the horizon, it's also a good opportunity for getting like really bold silhouettes. If you position somebody in front of that light source without any light hitting them from the front, you just get them like perfectly outlined as shadow. So that's also a very like bold and kind of striking look. But it's a type of light that you never see any other time of day, and if you only get it for like 15-20 minutes, and if you can capture like a really, really incredible scene, some movies like the recent Dune films have done some great stuff with like golden hour photography, and as much as I hate this movie, much as everyone else does, the Marvel failure, The Eternals, did have some did have some really, really beautiful golden hour shots that seemed like that was kind of the priority for them over anything else from a storytelling standpoint. But hey, they pulled that off, so
there you
go. But yeah, anyway, so it's a definite like object of desire for like every cinematographer and director is to like have some kind of like really nice golden hour shots, because I mean, you don't have to do anything. You just put stuff in front of the camera at golden hour and it looks incredible.
Yeah. Like, it's the most artistic natural light.
Yeah.
I think
so. But you've got to be ready to go, because it's one of those things where like as soon as you kind of see that light, it's like, dude, in 15 minutes this will be gone. You won't be able to see a damn thing. So you better be ready and go fast and not plan to try to do too much in that time. But yeah, no, it's incredible stuff. It's obvious why photographers and cinematographers see it as such a desirable thing to capture.
Yeah. So with that, I think the best way to kind of wrap this up is, you've been filming Pretty Lights for the last 2 years.
Yeah.
What is it like filming my light shows? Because I can only assume that it's not easy.
No, it's definitely not. I generally don't have a camera in my hands. I'm a
Well,
derogatory.
you work with the boys, and you guys all
Yeah,
collaborate on like what shots, and I
definitely.
know like there was the new camera that we brought in towards the end of last year that was out in front of house that kind of captured things differently than like when the boys are on stage.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah, no, the biggest challenge, with filming the light shows is just that incredible. I mean, it goes back to what you're saying about contrast. There is such a higher range of contrast between, lighting environments on the stage than there is like, would be in like a film production where you're controlling those things. Cause I mean, we'll go from pitch black to like completely lit up and, adjusting exposure on your camera to accommodate for those, especially when you don't know when it's going to happen.
yeah.
Um, makes it,
I don't know when it's going to happen either.
yeah, makes it very challenging. And, so that's why, Corey and Lane and Isaac are so incredibly skilled in ways. I mean, I know people see it and recognize it, but you have no idea like how hard they're working to get those shots on stage. It's not just a matter of like, oh, they've got like a good gimbal and a good camera. It's like, no. There is so much know-how happening, with the decision making they're making while shooting that stuff to get it to look like that. That is just, I mean, it boggles my mind. I've been working with them and like Ryan Barina in the past, who, is similarly extraordinarily talented. And, I'm still in awe of it. When they come back and I see their footage, I'm like, I watched the show and the whole time I was like, I don't know how the fuck they're going to film that, and then come back, backstage at Set Break or whatever and look at the footage. And it's like, you guys are magicians. Like, absolutely. They make it look so effortless and like everything was, planned to look that way when obviously it was not.
Yeah.
So yeah,
there's no plan. There's no plan amongst any of us. And
I don't know if if this has made it back to you, but there's occasional nights where you are referred to as Hazer Shark.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Because like, at Set Break or something, they'll just be like, man, Hazer Shark was out tonight. It was
that goes back to, if we're outdoors and I'm fighting, the elements, then we got to push things harder. Now, conversely, there are nights indoors where I'm feeling a little extra sassy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what ends up happening is if the show is going in a certain direction, let's call it ambitious or aggressive, maybe. I don't know. It's hard to like put, modifiers on these things and really like encapsulate them appropriately. But if I really want to accentuate the detail, or conversely, I want everyone to kind of get a little extra more lost in the experience, then I might push the atmosphere a little bit harder. So like there's no rhyme or reason to it specifically. It's all just a feel thing. And it becomes this like kind of second nature of like, this doesn't feel right, so we need to do this. And whether it's push haze forward or whether it's pull lighting back or whatever the case may be, it's always just like this intuition of does it feel right or does it feel wrong?
Mm-hmm.
And I can't ever put my finger on what exactly that feeling is. And I can't ever put my finger on when it actually feels right. But I'm always just trying to get as close as possible to getting it to that place. And it could be, it's different from night to night. So I feel for the boys when they're up there. And like, if I'm getting a little extra, sassy with the haze, I can only imagine what it's like up there. But they do seem to do a very good job of managing it all.
Yeah, they do. We curate it well also. What's, after the fact, when we come back and look to we're like, okay, this is the stuff we're actually going to put in front of people. But no, they do an amazing job. They've got a lot of tricks up their sleeve at this point to manage those things.
Yeah.
I was curious though to backtrack just a little bit when you mentioned that like playing outdoor shows, and if it's really windy and the haze is just blowing off, you have to find other ways to create that kind of contrast and make the show as poppy as it would
Yep.
be otherwise. What are some of the ways that you do that?
Well, the easiest way is to just pull lighting back and let video kind of take the forefront, because it doesn't rely on atmosphere. It's quite the opposite, actually. The less atmosphere there is, the more video kind of tracks, I guess, right?
Sure.
But there's other things, like I'll pull the entire light show onto the stage and not try to like shoot it out into the audience, because
okay.
then like I let depth kind of play. So if it's like kind of wavering on stage, even with or without a lot of haze, like the like reflections off the surfaces of the band or the stage or whatever, I let that kind of create the contrast instead. And it becomes a much more sort of like, I call it in the box light show, which just means it's staying on stage. So
Yeah.
less lasers. It becomes more like just, painting on the surface of things. When there was this whole conversation about like the first night of Red Rocks versus like the second night of Red Rocks, where the first night was very windy, but I was also just like having a bad night. And so like the light show just didn't feel impactful. And that was the sum. Whoa.
Yeah, I just saw that too. Yeah.
That was awesome.
Yeah.
Red Rocks haunts me to this day. The ghost just came and said hello.
It was kind of in that formation too. It kind of looked like that.
My arch nemesis. There are nights where my ability to convey my intentions are hindered. And Red Rocks is a prime example of a situation where no matter how hard I try, no matter how many tricks I pull out of my sleeve, the venue almost always wins. And now it's a combination of atmosphere. It's a combination of ambiance, because there's a lot of ambient light up there. And so that ambient light definitely affects my ability to really like control the environment. It also has to do with like the incline of the amphitheater itself. Like front of house is so close to stage, but then the audience is almost sitting above the light show. So that perception or perspective changes drastically for the audience as you go higher and higher. And so my perspective is so unique in that space. And then I have a hard time translating what it could or should look like for people that are way above me. And so it's this constant battle of like, this might look good down here, but it probably looks like shit up there, or vice versa. And there's never this comfort zone for me there. So what ends up happening more often than not is I err on the side of caution, and I don't push as hard, I guess. But then like the second night, I talked about this in social media and whatever, but I talked about how I kind of made this breakthrough. And I think what ended up happening was I stopped concerning myself with the what ifs, and I kind of widened my lens a little bit, and I said, all right, I'm not going to worry about what it looks like here. I'm not going to worry about what it looks like there. I'm going to try to put myself somewhere in the middle, and just, if it looks good in a broad sense, then it looks good. And so there's these times where you have to separate yourself from yourself, and place your eyeballs 150 feet in some other direction and say, okay, I'm going to try to make it look good over there and find that like middle ground. And if it can sensibly make sense, that's the turn of a phrase if ever there was one. If it can look good there, then it should look good everywhere.
Right.
And so it's this like kind of dance with the space to say, hey, you're not going to beat me tonight. Wind, bring it. Rain, bring it. Whatever. this, I don't know. It's a hard thing to kind of like quantify, but there is this portion of the light show that is very dependent on my comfort level within where I'm standing. And sometimes I'm hyper reliant on it, and then sometimes I'm like defiant of it. And so like a lot of times I'll walk a venue, and I'll walk like up in like the, you know, the upper sections or whatever, and I'll try to like imagine myself being there. And then there are times where like I'll walk really close to the stage, and I'll try to imagine myself being there. And the more comfortable I get in a show, the more I can kind of drift between all of those zones and be a little bit more cognizant of everyone's perspective of what the show is. And because, you know, the bigger these shows get, the greater the differences become between those people that are up front versus the people that are way up in the back. But it's my responsibility to kind of make it look good for all of them. But it's you know, the greatest challenge in the world. So like you'll see in the best shows that I've done, I think you'll see the most variation between like really, really tight stuff on stage that tracks really well for the entire room, and then the really big, sparse, wide open stuff that really looks interesting when you're far away, but looks almost like there's nothing happening when you're way up close.
Sure.
And then it's that like sway between those two dynamics that kind of like it keeps everyone on their toes, where it's like doesn't seem like anything, whoa, all of a sudden boom, you know, some big thing happens, and it shakes the entire crowd. And it's all a matter of like not being overly reliant on any one approach, keeping everything very fluid and very open, and trying to be cognizant of like, how much have I served this part of the audience versus how much have I served this part of the audience? Okay, I've been a little too aggressive. Time to reel it in a little bit. Let's just let things settle. Maybe paint more, you know, scenes, so to speak, and let everyone kind of absorb what's going on. And then kind of open the throttle back up and like, let's get a little bit more wacky with it. But yeah, it's a constant dance to like play with the atmosphere of the room versus play with the perception of people's perception of what the room is. And then, you know, never settling in any specific, you know, situation.
Right. Yeah, there's it's funny, this is going to be an odd comparison, but it's kind of how I feel about the Lord of the Rings movies. Is just they do this great job of like balancing and vacillating between like the truly like epic in scope and like the incredibly like intimate and lyrical.
There you go. Yeah.
That is like, you know, at times it feels like, you know, to put it back in the context of your shows, it's like there's times where you're watching it and it feels like this light show is being done just for you.
Yeah.
You know, and then there's other times where you're just like looking around the whole room. You're like, I can't even comprehend everything that's going on right now, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, finding that balance between those two where you kind of like ride those waves, you know, and if like the audio, you're in flow with like the audience and the show and everything, it's like, that's when the real fucking magic happens.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I think with that we're gonna wrap up. I do have a little bit of bookkeeping or housekeeping. So by the time this episode drops, let's see, that'll be next Monday. I think we'll have announced. No, actually, well, okay. So my good friends at Grassroots have decided we're gonna do a quick little merch drop for my birthday, which is March 16th. So stay tuned for that. There'll be a new hat and hoodie coming out. And then also, I guess this is a good time to announce this. I am moving my glorious family up to New York in May.
Woo.
And so with that, I need to get rid of all of the shit in my house. So, There will be a Laser Shark yard sale on Instagram over the next month or so. I'll also be discounting a bunch of stuff on the shop.
Nice.
Buy my crap so I don't have to move it to New York with me.
Greg has a lot of stuff. I haven't been to his place, but I've been on several video calls with him, and yeah.
Well, a lot of it's gonna come, but I'm definitely gonna thin some things out. I need to reel it in a little bit, but yeah, I don't know. That was shameless plugs are like the weirdest thing in the world to me.
Yeah.
But
hey, that's I mean, if we're gonna take this podcast to success, we're gonna have to start doing it. Hey,
we're gonna have to start doing some shameless plugs. So go to the phoebuscartel.com, check out the web store. I'm gonna have some paintings that I've never listed for sale for stupid cheap just to get them out of here. There'll be other fun things coming down the pike. And this has been the Stroke of Midnight. Thank you, Dorian.
Well,
Dorian froze.
Oh, yeah, I lost you there for a second.
Yeah.
I thought I was having a stroke, but thankfully
Dorian has not had
an internet issue. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right. Well, we're going to wrap it up for this week. Stay tuned next week when we have another meandering conversation about I don't know what. Dorian's going to surprise me again.
Yeah,
guys.
find out. Yeah, thanks so much.
Cheers.